Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we begin a 5-day program on China with the theme that China is not our enemy. As we begin the program, I think it's important for us to set a little bit of context, which we'll do today. I want to begin by just recalling that the United States now is escalating conflict with two superpowers simultaneously. At Humanity Rising, we have been tracking the escalating tensions and, in fact, proxy war between the United States and Russia in Ukraine, a conflict that is getting more and more dangerous day by day with an increasing probability of a nuclear exchange. The world has not been at this level of danger of a nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. And that is something that all of us need to take in as we contemplate how we live our lives, what issues we should be addressing. We need to bear in mind that the conflict between these two superpowers is escalating in increasingly dangerous ways. At the same time, the United States is escalating conflict with China with increasingly specific rhetoric articulated by several of the people in the U.S. military about the increasing probability of war against China, one general predicting war by no later than 2025 over Taiwan. So we find ourselves in a situation of an extraordinary contradiction. All of us are aware that we should be dealing with escalating climate turbulence as global warming and the ecological chaos that ensues is getting more and more accelerated, more and more severe everywhere around the world. At no time in human history has it been more urgently necessary for not only the superpowers, but every nation on earth to come together in enhanced cooperation to deal with escalating climate disaster, which is affecting all of us. But that's not what's happening. Instead, the United States has chosen to escalate tensions with Russia, with China, as part of a global strategy articulated 30 years ago by the neoconservatives that the United States would use the unipolar moment with the collapse of the Soviet Union to ensure global primacy, global supremacy, and would take any action necessary to ensure that no other power on earth could challenge the primacy of the United States. And that is what is now being played out in the escalating tensions with Russia and China. We've had two summits on Ukraine, and this is our first summit on China. We've convened these summits with CODEPINK, one of the most dynamic and effective peace organizations in the United States and around the world. So we want to welcome all the CODEPINK listeners and all of you in the Humanity Rising global community in over 130 countries. And however you're listening through Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube and through our live streaming partners, we want to welcome you as Humanity Rising seeks to elevate code red issues, but to do so in a way that not only informs, but catalyzes collaborative action so that we, the people of the world, can not only know what's really going on, but also can take the kind of actions that are required to compel our governments to remedy situations that only the governments in the end can solve. And the issue of war and peace, the issue of whether we're going to use nuclear weapons or not, are those kinds of critical, ultimately governmental issues. And the sad tragedy of our world is that our governments are not living up to their responsibilities, and therefore the accountability to ensure that they do resides with we, the people. It's my pleasure to introduce now Jodie Evans, one of the co-founders of CODEPINK, who's been co-moderating these summits with me over the last 6 months or so. She will be talking about the plans for the week, setting context for what we're going to be considering, introducing our guest, and then we'll circle back for a discussion for the balance of the time. But Jodie, thank you so much for everything that you've done with us, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our summits on peace. Yes, China is not our enemy. That was the title I decided to name this campaign because I was listening to a lot of lies and hate on China that was surprising me, and a lot of propaganda. And I realized, oh, this is just like the Iraq War all over again. It had the same pattern. It was happening in the same way. They were the same exaggerations and lies that a normal person shouldn't actually take in. And my response was, but China is not our enemy. We must cooperate for the concerns we have on the planet, for the people and the planet, especially with climate change. We must be in cooperation with China. So that's how this started. And I want to thank you for being here, because it really is how we build a movement, is that we ourselves get the confidence of our own voice to be a tuning for peace. There is so much misinformation out there that people just want to crawl under a hole, because it's argument and lies, and they're being filled with hate and distrust. And it is up to each one of us to be an antidote to that. And so peace is never about arguing. Peace is about offering different positions and not being attached to yours, except it is important that it enter the room, because this propaganda that we're seeing on Ukraine and on China is deep, and it's what people hold on to. So we have to have a lot of compassion for the people have intentionally, with effort and money, their hearts and minds, I say, have been weaponized for war. And we have to have patience with that. So what gives us strength is knowing other things that are stronger stones to stand on. I find the lies are actually easy to crack through once you give truth, because truth is actually a stronger standing place, and people want that. So I want to thank you for being here, for wanting to learn, wanting to know, and I hope wanting then to share, because that's the next most important thing after listening and learning. So I want to just give you an overview for the week. There's so much about China and about this campaign that I wanted to structure it in a way that you had what I felt you needed to at least start a deeper dive in. So the campaign was launched 3.5 years ago. So there's a lot of information on the website, and later I'll post some links. Today we're just going to do an overview, and we've got Wei, who's going to talk to us both about what it was like with the pivot to Asia being in China, and then what it was like to be Asian in the US going to college. So we can get that really intimate look. Tomorrow, we will look into China, the culture, history, political structure. Wednesday, we'll look at the propaganda and how that has already people paying the cost of this war and where that propaganda comes from. And then Thursday, we'll hear from Asian Americans who are paying the price. And Friday, we'll try to answer more of your questions and then how we can all be tools for peace and what's happening, what you can engage in, what you can share. It's a huge subject. China is a huge subject. So first, starting with China is not our enemy. China is beautiful. It has a 3,000-year culture. And that culture, at the core of it, holds peace. At the very core of it is, how do we get along? Confucius has a lot to do with that, which was really at a time where that arose to answer the question of how do we live together? And so, how do you live in relationship, in respect of, in the understanding of the whole, which is a very hard thing for Western people to understand, because we live such individualistic lives, and we kind of are in a pool of narcissism, because that's even what the media talks about. But what is it to be related in a way that the earth, your country, your community, and your family are as much a part of you as you are, is something I think it's a stretch for us to understand. But that's been there. And also there's been this commitment that those who rule a country are responsible to the people. So that's also very old and expected. So, like the under heaven, it needs to feel like you're under heaven, or the leaders aren't doing their job. I also want to say I was just in Dali, and I'm going to flow through this with having just spent a month in China. And one of the things I learned was that 1,200 years ago, in this place where there was leaders of this whole area of China, it's vast, at some point, the ruler would leave his post as a ruler and move into the temple and become a monk. And I thought, wow, in this time where people in power in the United States, I don't know about the rest of the world, but I have to say in the United States, they will not relinquish power. We have a senator who won't let go. It's crack cocaine, this power. And I don't think it's meant to be that way. It's been so created in this structure that it's really just crack cocaine. They won't let go of it. And I thought it was interesting that they moved even the value of philosophy and the connection to that which helps us be healthy is at the core of this culture. Now, it is also a culture that's in modernity. It is complex. It is enormous. It's almost 1.5 billion people. So to say China is also insane. It is made up of many, many ethnic Chinese minorities. It's made up with vast differences of bioclimates, bioregions, histories, different, even smaller histories, because it is a collection of places. So what's happening in one can have, little to do with what's happening in another. And that is still true. What it's like to live in the freezing cold of northern China and the balmy heats of southern China, create even different personalities, as we know this globally. So to say China is, we need to hold in our mind the vastness of also diversity. So when we started this campaign, what I recognized was that there was a lot of propaganda, and it was targeted at the progressive movement. my movement, the part that my community, the place that I'm part of. And those, it was definitely weaponizing the beautiful hearts and minds, the compassion and the empathy of those that are progressives. And so the first year I felt like this community of China's not our enemy, we really spent in educating that we couldn't let those we love be used for war. And the State Department, the Pentagon had thrown out what I call a lot of weeds to grab people. And then if you started to go in the weeds and talk about how that wasn't true, you got kind of grabbed in an argument, which I didn't feel was useful. And then it was like, let's just move up to China is not our enemy and stay out of the weeds. That is enough. So we did about a year of work of pulling the progressives off from being used for war. And that took a lot of education, a lot of one-on-one education. They literally wanted Ilhan Omar to be the poster child for this going to war with China. So reminding people that there is no greater violation of human rights than war. There is no greater violation to the planet than war. There, like all these places that you're being dragged into the weeds, war, we're forgetting the costs of war. We have forgotten the costs of war. We get a lot of manipulation. We get a lot of hate. But when do we actually have to sit for a day and really be with what the costs of war are? And I know, Jim and I talked to a lot of people in Ukraine. We are not getting this in our media. We're getting driven to war. We're getting manipulated to war. But the costs of war, I think, would help us change the capacity that we have to be dragged in and be used by. So this campaign is about, there is a beautiful place. It is complicated as we are. It has as many complications as the United States. But who are we to tell it who to be? What we should be is saying, we all have to get along on this planet that is fragile. We need to be cooperating on climate change. We need to be cooperating on poverty. We need to be cooperating on how we live together instead of creating more wars and more devastation and more death and more people homeless, both the refugees and those at home, because we're taking United States taxpayer money to fund this. And I want to go back to that funding piece. The beginning, when Bush and family, Bush and friends were pushing for this war on Iraq, that kind of brings me into this story. They told us that it was going to cost no more than $200 billion. That was what Rumsfeld was saying to members of Congress. The 20 years of the war on terror cost $22 trillion of taxpayer money. $22 trillion. Not only does it create a culture of weaponization and war and hate and other, creating an enemy, but it has robbed that $22 trillion from the needs of the people of the United States and literally undermined the infrastructure. So I want to talk about what China did in that same 20 years. It didn't invest very little in its military. Its budget for the military did not raise, and it spent its money building the infrastructure for its people and for the planet. It built infrastructure that would take down their contribution to climate change. China, I think, is the only country, I think maybe there's 3 others, that have come to where they agreed in Paris. So they took that money and instead decided to serve the people and the planet. And in the same period of time, they took 800 million people out of poverty. So, let's look at that also. And then we have the United States under Obama pivoting to Asia. And, that pivot had many reasons, but mostly that the United States could see that China was growing as an economic power. It had failed in the Middle East. It had basically destroyed a lot of the Middle East. And with that, Northern Africa, it didn't want to talk about it anymore. It didn't want to be engaged anymore. It's just like, let's just move to fresh territory. And so it started, upping the military. And I just want to say the pivot to Asia is not just about China. And we should remember that. And with Ukraine, we talked about in the summit, we've watched BRICS rise, but it was a pivot to China, India, and Indonesia, which represent close to 4 billion people on the planet. And so it's a market, it's a power, the power of them all coming into their strength as countries, really spending time strengthening themselves. And that's not to comment on leadership, it's to comment on the country itself. The country, the people have moved into modernity, and have moved into ways to make their citizens happier. And that's true for China, India, and Indonesia. That doesn't mean all the people are happier, but it's where we are in the United States, there's a lot of unhappiness. You have to look at, there's 4 billion people that are happier than people in the United States, pretty much. So just kind of understand what's happening. It was a lot about the economy and a lot about having military control over a place that the Obama and those in power didn't feel like they had enough control. And for much of that time, they deployed the State Department and many people into engaging themselves in summits, in meeting with the governments, in creating partnerships. But I want to say it's where the rules-based order kind of started seeping up. You have to be part of our rules-based order, as we've seen Biden kind of embrace fully. But the United States has 250 or more bases surrounding China. And that costs a lot to the people there, near those bases, in those bases, the planet that it destroys, the pristine ecosystems it destroys. And I want to say, CODEPINK, we've been engaged at trying to stop some of them, including the one in Jeju Island in South Korea, because it was one of the most beautiful, pristine ecosystems you've ever seen. And they decided to destroy it with a military base. So this pivot to Asia is pretty ugly in its expression. So, we've seen with the Ukraine war also that NATO, that belongs, in Europe, is also pivoting to Asia, and we've got NATO moving to around China. Which has nothing to do with peace and should have nothing to do with Asia. Also, I want to just say there, China does have one other base. It's in Djibouti, but that was because the United States asked them to participate in anti-piracy operations and to build that base. Now, with the US bringing weapons to Taiwan, China, of course, has to respond by upping its military spending, which it had resisted doing. But when you start to, a war on someone, they have to race to meet you. So this is part of the problem we don't want to have happen, because now with US wanting to spend another couple of $2 trillion on new nuclear weapons, what can China do but meet that? Any leader in another country that's watching the military rise to, and threatening war on it, generals say that's going to happen in 2 years, you have to respond. And I think that's one of the crimes of this US war on China, is that it's just creating more weapons on the planet, which we should not have. The other thing that we saw at the beginning of this is the propaganda creates xenophobia, the hate and the lies, of which there are many, which is on purpose, which I think is another crime. To hate on another, to create an enemy of another. How juvenile, how 5-year-old, this is, actually you learn not to do that in kindergarten. This is, distorted and really grown-ups, a behavior grown-ups should not be engaged in, because it has effects. And we saw very early on the effects of this with a rise of like 3,000% in xenophobia and violence against Asians. And I want to say Asians because in the United States, most people, first of all, know nothing about Asia, but also don't know what country you're from when you're Asian. And so that meant that everyone that was Asian is pulled under the umbrella and are vulnerable to the attacks, to the xenophobic hate attacks. And, you know, in talking about this, I just want to bring up also that in the West, we don't recognize how much our thinking is imperialist thinking, even those of us who are anti-imperialists. And there's a whole, China and Asia are different cultures than the West. And we constantly project our own culture and our own thinking on Asia to try to think about it, and it's wrong. We miss by projecting the violence and hate and militarism of the West that we are so steeped in on China. We miss the beauty, and we miss what it is not, you know, look, the great book about never going to war is from China. So, you know, we project ourselves instead of really looking to understand. And I hope that part of this is that it whets your curiosity about what is China, what really is China, and not what is the propaganda of China, or what has China been in before the last decade. China changes faster probably than any place on the planet. I don't know of a place that changes faster. But when I was a kid, when you were eating your meal, my parents used to say you have to finish because there's a starving child in China. That, you know, in 1970, it was one of the poorest countries on the planet. It is now neck and neck with the United States. I met with women who remember their grandmother's bound feet. So, I mean, just take a minute to think about what that must feel like in a psyche, in a human that is experiencing that rapid change. And I can only relate it to coming of age, you know, going to school in 1970 and talking to my grandmother where, you know, from automobiles to computers had happened in her lifetime, from telephones. And think about what it felt like in the United States then, where anything felt possible. And there was a sense of kind of buoyancy. I relate that to China right now. It's like when so much has changed, and yet the dark side hasn't quite moved in yet. And don't think China doesn't understand there's a dark side to where they are. And they are trying to take steps that I think we didn't take in the United States, that understand power, the cost of power, that understand and respect that, you know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That understand, you know, one of the things China does is it learns. It pays attention and learns. It knows it's made a lot of mistakes, and it's 70 years into an experiment that, you know, ends in, I think, 49. It's in an experiment. It understands it's in an experiment. United States is in an experiment. I think sometimes we forget that. We forget to pivot. We forget to learn from our mistakes. China's learned from its mistakes. It's learned from other people's mistakes. So it learns in an interesting way. Like, one of the things I learned while we've been doing this campaign is, like, in 5 different cities, cities are as big as countries in China, it will try 5 different solutions to 5 different ways to address a problem, and then watch what happens, and then, you know, take the one that has the best results, and then everybody does it. But so think about that. Like, how does this work? How is it affecting the people? Listening. I mean, one of the things it does is listen to the people. There's a film that was made about how they took everyone out of poverty. It was a person in Wall Street that wanted to understand that. And he hired an Emmy award-winning filmmaker out of DC and took him to China. They took footage, came back, edited, made the film, got PBS to produce it, showed it once. People watching felt it made Beijing look too good. And so it's been censored. So, you know, in it, you understand like how they make things happen. And it's on a very intimate level. Direct democracy is happening when you watch this, how they took people out of poverty. But it, you know, a responsibility to care for the people is an interesting thing to witness. And I also encourage everyone to go there, to have their own experience, because it is vast and the experiences will be so different. So that's, you know, a little bit of an entry. I also want to talk about Taiwan a little, and this pivot, this last 20 years of propaganda in Taiwan, of the commitment the United States has had, and we heard Blinken come back with it again from his last trip, that there is one China, and that when the United States starts invading the idea of one China and trying to change it, it doesn't work out well for the people. It didn't work out well for the people in Tibet when the CIA armed Tibet, taught them to go to war and tried to get them to be the front line of war on China. It doesn't work out in Shenzhen when the United States goes to the king of Saudi Arabia and asks him to radicalize the Muslims. It doesn't work out well for Taiwan already, and they have back-channeled to the leadership of the US to say, shut up, stop lying about China invading Taiwan. Every person in China knows that China is not going to bomb itself, but you can get, you can get the Americans to believe anything. So the Taiwanese say you can't do that anymore because now that's got major contracts being canceled. It is affecting its economics. So let's just look at, what happens when a country is used as a tool for war on another country, Ukraine. Taiwan is watching that and does not want to be Ukraine. So, we'll hear more about Taiwan from a professor later in the week, but it's also one of the weeds, but it's also a place that we need to understand as people in the United States, even though Biden says, yes, we believe in a one China policy, and Blinken comes back and says, we will have nothing to do with Taiwan independence. They are still, those are words, the behaviors matter, and the behaviors are already hurting people, including the hate that they're driving. So I've given you a little, ground to walk on. And there's, what I'd really like to do is now bring in Wei. Wei Yu has been CODEPINK's China's Not Our Enemy campaign coordinator, and a lot of the things that you see on her site, she's created. She was born in Tianjin, China, a port near Beijing, and has lived in the United States since her high school years. When she was at university, she was after a degree in sociology and international studies, and conducted an independent research project on neocolonial bias in the global North academia. She's worked with several nonprofit organizations serving women, racial minorities, and other progressive causes. She's passionate about anti-imperialism and peace-building work, and also is a vegan chef in her free time. So Wei, if you can bring us into your story.
Thank you so much, Jodie. Hi, everyone. Good morning, if you're in the Western Hemisphere. So like Jodie mentioned, I was actually born in China. And since today we're talking about the 10 years of pivot to war on China, let's just go back in time a little bit and to the beginning of Obama administration's pivot to Asia. So I was actually living in China at the time. I was 12 years old. And it was also, I remember it was like the summer holiday right between my 6th grade and 7th grade when I was supposed to start junior high school. And that was the summer when I first got politicized, essentially. that was one eventful summer that really opened up my eyes on a lot of international issues, mainly because there was this what was on everyone's mind at the time was this territorial dispute between China and Japan, with East China Sea and some islands. And this is like a very this is kind of like a weed, like Jodie mentioned, and there's like a lot of historic issues and between the relations of there's a lot of historical issues in the relations between China and Japan, and I'm just not going to get into that. But I also remember that because there's so much history between the two countries there, from the Japanese occupation of China in the 20th century, or the Japanese occupation of like much of East Asia in 20th century, and also the Sino-Japan War back in the 1800s. There's like just a lot going on between the countries. But then I remember seeing in the news, and I was questioning, why does the United States have something to say about this? Why is the United States being a provocateur in this situation and just escalating tension? Why is the United States sending warships all the way across the Pacific Ocean to have these military exercises with Japan? And it really just made me question about like, what is the whole thing about? Is there like an agenda behind it? And then I was just so confused and so afraid that entire summer, because like I mentioned again, it was the summer holidays, so I got a lot of free time. And what I ended up spending this free time I'm supposed to enjoy is that I just stayed at home and watched the news like the entire day. And I remember there was like a dedicated news channel, right? And they would have like a news program every hour, and they are pretty much repeating the same thing because you're not going to get any news unless there's an update. But then I would still watch every repetition of that program at the top of every hour, because I was just so afraid that maybe like, oh, the war has already started and then I just don't know what's going on. And it was just, again, just like a very fearful, very confusing summer. And just questioning myself, like, why is the United States involved, and what its agenda to create fear and panic among people and among like little kids like me. And then a couple of years later, I moved to the States, and then a lot of like struggle with racism also, as well as xenophobia. But then, like Jodie mentioned, in a couple of days, we're going to talk about like U.S. foreign policy and also how it affects Asian Americans. But my story, I have like the most memorable thing for me, it was definitely during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw in the news a lot of these anti-Asian attacks that are happening just randomly in the streets. And also a lot of them are targeting the elderly in the community, which is just very upsetting. And I was also just very fearful about just going outside and that I might be the target of the next racist attack. So I remember during that time, because I was so afraid, and then I was just trying to think of anything that would keep myself safe. And what I did was that, because I was in college, so every time I went outside, I would make sure to put on like a t-shirt or a sweatshirt with my college's name on it. So it goes like Jacksonville or like Go JU, just like so trying to like really Americanize myself and just dim down like my identity so that people would just hopefully ignore me and so that I could stay safe. And looking back, that's just like such silly thinking. But then at the time, I really thought that that's what's going to keep me safe from all of these racist attacks. And recently I was hanging out with my friend, and her boyfriend just flew in town to visit her. And her boyfriend is actually Afghan. And when he flew into town, he was wearing this t-shirt that has like an American flag on his chest. So he did that to avoid getting harassed at the TSA or at the airport. And then I remember thinking, I get it now. I'm East Asian, and then this is like a Middle Eastern man, but like I get that feeling now. And going back to what Jodie said, we are seeing this propaganda and also this preparing for war to China, not unlike what we saw in Iraq 20 years ago. And I can tell you from like this individual experience, it really is like that. And we just sort of had like this bonding moment, like even though like me East Asian and then him Middle Eastern, and we just have like this interesting experience of like people that look like us are being attacked as this preparation for war going on. And yeah, so today I just really want to like share my experience, and also thank you so much for like Stan sharing like all the links in the chat, and I'll hand back to Jodie. And I just hope you all like really take home with this experience, like this my story with you is just that all of this preparation of war is really creating fear for people who wants nothing to do with it.
Thank you so much, Jodie. Thank you so much. You're turning everything most people know on its head. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to start with you, Wei. What Jodie described about how China organizes itself and the way that they're interpreting the democratic principles of governance is very unique. And I would love to hear from you as someone who grew up in China. What was your personal experience of the Chinese polity? You know, we're consistently told that it's a dictatorship. Joe Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator just a few days ago, that it's a totalitarian system, that it's a police state. But what was your experience as just an individual growing up over there, and how would you evaluate the Chinese form of governance in relationship to what Jodie was saying?
Yeah. So while I was in China, I was again just like a child and just like really growing up. But then my experience was really just that this democratic process and the sanctity associated with it is just like so deeply instilled in my mind. When I was starting school, actually we would have like election within our class every month. So how my school did it was that every month there's going to be an election for the best students of the month, basically. We had around like 30-ish students in my class, so we would elect 2 every month. And you are just elected by your peers, right? Your teacher doesn't get a vote on it. Your parents don't get a vote on it. It's really just like students voting on who they think deserve the title of the best students. And it's not even like you're voting for your best friends. It's always every month. It's like the kids who get the good grades or the kids who are well behaved in class, they are always getting elected. And I remember there was one time, I think I was around like 3rd grade, maybe. It's so interesting because on that day we're supposed to have like an art class. And I so happened I brought some like extra art supplies that day, and then I was like sharing it with my classmates because I was just, you know, being nice and like being nice to other kids. And then our teacher walked into the classroom and seeing me passing out stuff, and that was also like an election day when we were supposed to vote for best student. Our teacher was like, "That's bribing. That's not okay." And then I just got so scared. I was like, oh no, I did something so terrible. So really this democratic value, this like process, like you learn about it at a very young age. You get to participate in it as soon as you start school at 6 years old. And there's some sort of like sanctity associated with it. Like it just can't be tainted. You can't bribe people, and then you can't do any like thing that will make you suspicious of bribing. Yeah, that was just like my experience. Like you learn about this whole election at a very young age, and then you get to practice it, and also everyone's being fair.
Thank you so much, Jodie. I'd love to hear a little bit more because you just came back from China. Tell us a little bit about your trip over there, and in particular, what you were learning about how the Chinese society at every level self-organizes itself around various issues and concerns, because I think that is a sort of a foreign concept to the way we understand democracy in the United States, which is an election every 2 or 4 years. We don't have a sense of democracy at a family level or at a community level. And the Chinese have developed that over the eons of time. And I think our audience would be very interested in a deeper dive into your understanding of how they self-organize.
Well, so I also just want to comment on Wei's thing, what Wei was talking about voting. I don't think Americans understand that in the last election in China, 800 million people voted, which is a larger percentage than people who vote in US elections. So, in the sense of like the value of elections, also that value, and that the political system is like the US system. It's you elect to select. So at the very end, the leadership is selected in this, I think with more people actually in the process, we have 535 that select the president of the United States. I think it's a bigger number in China. I think it's 2,000 and something. So it's the same elect to select process that we have in the United States. So just wanna to understand that. There's also 2 structures. There's the party, and then there's the running of the country. So the cabinet falls under the prime minister. And that's like the military, how things run, that's like one thing. And then the party's a totally different thing. And she's the head of the party. He's not the head of the country. I also want to say the party is only 90 million members. So, people think it's a dictatorship and a monoculture, and the poly of China is more diverse than the United States. So just to say that, that it's got all kinds of things in its threads, and so at the very core of how the country is the same way it's been for 2,500 years, and that is locally. And so, like I talked about the diversity, my experience of this was my husband, who lives in Beijing, Shanghai, and Sanya, and his experience of COVID, the time of COVID. It depended on where you lived as your experience. The other thing is people talk about the China shutdown. I think 5 cities in China were locked down, which totaled maybe 100 million people. It's a country of 1.5 billion. So we also are fed a very narrow thread of what that COVID lockdown looked like. To most of China, there was no lockdown. And I also want to say, remember when I talked about the experiment was happening in Shanghai, and another experience was happening in another city. 5 different cities were doing it in 5 different ways. Shanghai was the worst. And that was in 3 months to figure something out. And I would say that probably contributed to okay, we have to open up, and may I say that looked like a failure, but he became the prime minister of the country after that. And I want to, let's look at that, because why? Because he was willing to take the hardest task, to fulfill the hardest task, and help everybody understand something, and was rewarded for it. So, failure is a big deal in China. It's like when you take on what's going to be the failure, it's like you're seen as having courage, having commitment, being willing to do what has to be done for everybody to learn. And I think I found that super interesting, because I was like, oh my God, this guy's going to get canned. And then he becomes the prime minister. I'm like, oh, I don't understand anything. So I'm constantly reminded that my US mind does not do well. And as I try to figure out so I think, which, I'm, goes to Biden and Blinken having no clue what's going on in China, or having capacity to communicate. And I know that it's also their immaturity and manipulation and bullying don't play well with Chinese culture or characters. So what happens is that, and again, 2,500 years of experience, what is real in your life happens locally. So people are more connected to what's happening locally. They're a part of that. You're part of your community. You have a responsibility to it. Somebody's like a community leader, but you listen to them. That's where, because they're all going to do it differently depending on the neighborhood you live in, what's needed, who's old, who's young, what the pushback's going to be. Because Chinese people, there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of like, I don't like that. I don't want that. So it happens locally and it happens in community, and you're engaged. You go to meetings and once a week. Where the poly happens is locally. And we see that with the taking the people out of poverty. It happened first person to person, and then it was about the community. And then what they delivered was infrastructure, not money. Money was the last thing. I don't know, Wei, if you wanted, it seemed like in the chat somebody wanted to see the film. If you could share that. I think that inside that film, you get to see that the poly goes deep into what is the relationship, what is the personal experience, because it's about serving the people. It's not about what is my idea and how do I go off and do it. It's always iterating also. Did that work? Didn't that work? And I think one of the interesting things out of the film on taking people out of poverty is the understanding that you're playing with that. Thank you, Wei. You're playing with that problem all the time. And so, coming from Venice Beach, where I have 5,000 unhoused people in my neighborhood, to a country where I couldn't find a homeless person. And I said, where, there must be homeless people, take me to them. And, people looked at me crazy, like, of course people fall through the fabric of society, but they're picked up. And maybe somebody's homeless for a day and at the most 2 before the community picks them up and they're taken to what's needed for them. And so, just that concept of building a fabric of society that cares for everyone. And then the other thing is that, first of all, like China is so clean. I've decided there must be 2 million gardeners because the gardens are lush, and what happens to you, and I'm a gardener, so maybe that's, I'm, deeply moved by it in another way, but I really feel what happens to us when we see beauty is peace. That I think it takes our heart to peace. And so to be in a place that cares so deeply about beauty is profound. And then to find what the community does in that beauty. I live across from a park in Shanghai, and I just always go down like every hour to see what's happening in the park. So in the morning, there's a whole crowd and they're doing Tai Chi. And then there's like, I'm told I like have the folks there help me know what's going on. There's then a whole bunch of parents come and they're doing matchmaking and they're bringing their kids and introducing their kids. And there's like this whole matchmaking thing that happens. And then there's always equipment in the park where people can exercise, and you see all these, retired people working on the machines, knowing that they need to keep in shape. Keeping in shape and eating is a big thing, like she's like all about like, how do you eat, because when you become modernized and wealthier, bad eating habits take form. So they try to work on exercise and eating. And then there's my favorite is the old guys with their little tiny bird cages and their little tiny birds, and they come and trade bird cages and birds, and it's just like so beautiful and they're so adorable. And so just like, and then the game playing and and the women who just like have these crowds around them because they know how to play the game better and everybody's watching. I can't follow it, but it's just community happening. And that's steeped from the relationships you have from where you live, that your neighbors, that my friend Tings talked about how much they loved the lockdown, because out of that, the neighbors got to know each other better. Everybody wasn't running off to work. And they created things that still exist about how they order their food to the building. at a discount price, and then they all share it, and they've like got into that ordering thing that's continued. So as we know, through COVID, that we learned what is essential, and some of those patterns have continued. Some of those things have continued out of the lockdown with those in China. So I hope that answered your question, Jim.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Wei, would you add anything to what Jodie said?
I think Jodie said everything beautifully.
Well, I can testify to that. I was actually born in China in 1951 in western Sichuan province, right near the Tibetan border, and then grew up till I was about 15 in Taiwan. And I was always struck by the communal nature of Chinese society and the constant interactivity between parents and their kids and families and compounds, and just a constant chatter of a communal nature, so that the individual is always identified relationally with a larger collective. So I'm not surprised, Jodie, that with 1.5 billion people, there's no homelessness. Or if there is homelessness, it happens for a day or two before that collective closes in and begins to ameliorate whatever that situation is and that individual. And I think that's one of the reasons why Chinese civilization has lasted for as long as it has, nearly 4,000 or 5,000 years of continuous Chinese history. And there's no country in the world that even comes close to that level of durability over time. And one of the keys has been a collectivist, communal understanding of the individual, which is not a negation of the individual, but an understanding, just like in nature, we're identified not as separate, but as relationally always within a larger whole that scales. And it's the capacity of a society to hold the different levels of interactivity and identity that really marks longevity. And that is one of the great teachers, I think, for not going to war. And the reason why China, if you compare it with the United States, is just a fraction of the hostilities that the United States has experienced. And I'd like to turn to that whole domain, and I'd like to fill out what you said a little bit with a comparison of the US, Chinese, and also Russian military budgets, because it was just released not long ago that the United States this year is spending more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. The United States runs at about $800 billion officially, but there's another couple 250 billion that's in what they call the dark budget. So you have a generally understood as a military budget by the United States of around $1 trillion. China is second, and the official Chinese budget was under 300 million. So the United States is spending 3 times the Chinese. It's very important for people.
But the Chinese have 5 times the population.
With 5 times the population. Yeah. And it's also important to bear in mind that the Russian military budget was only $48 billion. So the United States is spending 20 times what the Russians are spending on their military. And right now, if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, it's the combined military capacity of the United States and NATO going against Russia that is at the heart of the asymmetry in that conflict. And is one of the reasons why the Russians keep saying, we're going to keep it moderate, but if you start overwhelming us, we will use nuclear weapons. And it is the lack of appreciation of the gravity of that on the part of most Americans that feeds this exuberance, this irrational exuberance around war. And if you correct me, Jodie and Wei, but if my understanding is that China went to war against Vietnam after the Vietnamese War for a very, very brief period of time. There were hostilities in Tibet, but you could count, I think, the number of Chinese military operations on one hand.
Let's talk about provoking in a war. So if there's, I think this is an important thing to witness, is that when provoked, when things, they both came out of a provoking, not out of a, peace was happening and then provoking started happening.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
So I just want to, war is what the United States does on innocent people. Like, to me, I think there's, because people talk about peace, like defending oneself. If we look at, what happened with Putin and Ukraine, it's like, I don't want a war, I don't want a war, I don't want a war. And if you get closer, there's going to be a war. And then if you continue to arm Ukraine, I've got to come in before it's fully, like, you're going to force me to move. There's, China, when provoked, will act to protect itself. I would say that's most places. So we really need to understand about provoking.
Yeah, for sure.
Horrific Ukraine is. And this did not have to happen. And that's the importance of this campaign that I really want to say is that provoking, will cause, China has been through hell. It's years of, indignity forced on it by Europe and the United States and Japan. And just, I saw also not the valuing, just also never being valued or recognized for what, so it provoked, it will act. And it's shown that. And I think that's important to know. That that the United States was part of that provoking in Tibet.
Oh, for sure. And I was raising it that if you think that provoked or not, if you think of the Chinese using military maybe less than 5 times in the last 50 years, I think the latest estimate is that the United States has used military action one way or another over 250 times in the last 30 years alone.
What the important thing about this, Jim, is that every war that the US gets into, the rich get richer. So it loses the wars, the country loses the war, the people lose the war, the people spend the money on the war and they get nothing back for it, but the rich get richer. So the US makes on war. Look, talk to people in Europe right now, they are losing in this war, but they are tied, they are yoked to the United States, so they're losing. But the United States, it wins in war, including the Civil War, the rich got richer. So China, when we're talking about the philosophy that they run on, it's a win-win philosophy. Everyone in China knows it's like that philosophy, that part of your culture is like in how they relate. It's like, it's got to be win-win, right? And so they lose in war. And so in the China mind, war is a lose. It's like, it's in the art of war, it's a lose. That is in their culture. And they actually do lose. They're not set up to make bank on war. The United States is set up from the beginning to make bank on war. And, I love that Bobby Kennedy Jr. is bringing, really bringing up his uncle and his race, which for nothing else, his race, is raising up peace. And one of the things his uncle knew, because he listened to Eisenhower, was the job of the president was to keep the brake on the military congressional, Eisenhower called it the congressional military industrial complex. He knew because when he became president and he saw what they had done to Korea, and then, he created North Korea, he cried and said, stop this. We saw what happened with our dear Daniel Ellsberg, who was with us in our first summit and has left this planet, but, in such dignity and grace, exposing the lies of Vietnam and how horrific that was, that it turned the stomach of people who had been in that war. So I think this is really important for us to know. When we're being used by the State Department, we're really being used by those who make a killing on killing. And taking in that propaganda is just so you can be fodder for war also. We look at war, you can't end war till you end the war economy, because war serves the war economy. And I want to just say, since I brought Daniel into the room, that I learned something from Daniel's death and being with him over those last 3 months of his dying. The dignity and grace and the fierceness. And so we look out and I hear fears of, I could say the folly of fretting and people fretting and climbing into their corners and oh my God. In Dan's life, he knew the truth about all of it, about nuclear weapons, about war, about the violence of the culture, about the society and its violence. And he never lost his grace or his dignity, and he never quit talking until his last breath. And I just want to raise that up, that, no matter what happens, he never went into fear. He never got used by it. He was just beauty, dignity, and grace till the very end. And I long to follow in his footsteps, because that's what we need right now. It's not to be caught up in the fear, not to be caught up in the separation, but to know what we know and share it as a service to peace. And he never stopped doing that. So we come together in these, with Humanity Rising, for all of us to be a tuning fork. I mean, I hear things like things should be this way, things should be that way. It's us. It is only us. It is, it's how we enter the world, how we share with friends. Because, when we started, Stan was talking about a movement. Right now, the movement for peace is being silenced. I just came from the halls of Congress. I met with 30 members of Congress, or did a teach-in in that many offices. It's like inside those halls of Congress, they're not allowed to talk about peace. They get buzz-sawed, as one said, buzz-sawed for bringing up peace. And inside of each office is an embedded member of the military that's called a military fellow in these offices, that is at every meeting talking about how many more weapons we're going to buy and how much more we're going to be engaged in. And I had one member of Congress staff say to me, as I was telling them what I saw in China, she was like, well, we know better than you because we get briefed by the State Department. And I was just like, whoa. I came back, I'm sharing stories from the ground, but you are listening to the State Department who's taken us to wars, who's driven this hate, who are irresponsible. And I mean, like, just so you know, it is really up to us, that you've got to be able to look at this. They're lost. I mean, Jim's very kind in saying, they're insane. This is insane. And we have to recognize that. And I think one of the lessons I take from China is they recognize things early. And we know as human beings that when we recognize the problem early, we have a much better chance of having a soft landing than when we avoid, ignore, deny, and then get crushed by it. So if we recognize that China is not our enemy, that this is a war we could stop, it's really about each one of us changing the hearts and minds of those we know, because China is not our enemy. It's wrong to make enemies. China knows better than to make enemies. It's, how are we going to, in this democracy that is broken, you can't have democracy when there's this much inequality and there's no real journalism. Can't have democracy. But we're about to enter being swept away by that game. It is a game that is, definitely managed by those that are in power. When trillions of dollars are spent on election, you have to understand who owns those politicians. And I mean, I was in Congress, the military industrial complex owns those politicians. They speak like they're on their staffs. They're asking for more than the Pentagon asked for. They're trying to be heroes. This is grotesque. And the politics is infected with militarism and war and violence. And we need to be the healthy selves. We need to be the healthy selves, and we need to do it with joy and love, no expectation of outcome, because we have no idea how deep people are in the manipulation of this propaganda. It takes time, it takes our patience. So it's just that, be imbued by the peace and the information that we continue to share, because we want to give you strong ground to stand on so that you can share and be tuning forks for peace, tuning forks for cooperation. The planet needs it, the people need it, we all need it. And I just want to say it's a beautiful place to live your life from. As a peace activist, I know there are many listening, that it's also a very beautiful life.
Thank you, Jodie, so much. That's a beautiful way, I think, to end our program today. I would just make one or two quick comments, and then maybe Wei, you can have a final word, and then Jodie, you can tee us up for tomorrow. And that is that this month marks the 60th anniversary of the speech that President John Kennedy gave at the American University in 1963. Which is one of the most extraordinary speeches that I believe any American president has ever made about the issues of war and peace. And if you would just Google it, John Kennedy, American University speech, 1963, it's easily accessible. And then compare it with something that is coming out of the US Congress or coming from Joe Biden. You'll see the truth of what Jodie is saying, that the entire polity of the governance of the United States is caught up in the war machine. And if you would watch this movie called 13 Days, which is a Hollywood production on the Cuban Missile Crisis in October, there were 13 days in October 1962. Where we came very close to nuclear war, and everybody wanted to go nuclear. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, most of the cabinet, and it was only John and Bobby Kennedy and Adlai Stevenson, who was the ambassador to the United Nations, that stood up against that rising momentum and discerned a way toward a political solution. And John Kennedy was so unnerved by not only the power of the military-industrial complex, even against him as president of the United States, that he began negotiations with Nikita Khrushchev, the general secretary of the Communist Party and then the Soviet Union, to begin negotiations that led to the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. And it was in advance of that signing of that treaty that he gave this extraordinary speech about understanding those that we hold as enemies and valuing that they also have a point of view. And what he said was crucial in terms of what we're experiencing today in Ukraine. He said, in a nuclear world, you never want to place your adversary who has nuclear weapons in a position of either surrender or using those weapons. And that is the position that increasingly the United States is putting Russia today. But there's nobody in the White House with the elegance and the wisdom of John Kennedy. That's what we need. And we also need it around China. So when Jodie connects in the spirit of Daniel Ellsberg, who since the 1960s has been an indefatigable warrior against the use of nuclear weapons and for peace, we all need to do whatever we need to imbibe that spirit, because that spirit is the only thing that's going to lead us through. It's an extraordinarily subtle political history of the 1960s that are well worth examining and studying, particularly Kennedy's speech at the American University, if we want to know the posture and disposition that we need to embrace today, because the world has never been more dangerous since that time as it is right now. And we need to embody the kind of enlightenment that is required. So thank you for raising that and for your comments, Wei. So let's start with you. Any final words that you would like to make, Wei, and then you, Jodie, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim, for having me here. Like you said, like this is really scary time, but then that's what makes me appreciate even more about these like forums, these events that we're having. It really makes us feel that there's a movement, there's a lot of us all together in this trying to make peace. And what Jodie said like a bit earlier really stuck with me is that they see this as a game, right? In April, the House Select Committee on China, they actually had this war game about like they basically planned out how a conflict with China over Taiwan would look like, and they literally saw everything as pieces on the chessboard, and that just like takes away the humanity of people like of China, of people in the US, just everyone. And then it's very important that here we're having like these conversations and all of you here hearing my story, that making us realize that we're just all people and we're just all humans and all connected. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Wei. Jodie, final word.
Thank you, Wei. Yeah, I think Wei said it, that all this talk I call the weeds takes us away from our humanity. We know better. We know it's like we give away our own common sense, our own heart feelings to all this information that we don't understand and we think is true because we think the state, we think people have our best interests at heart. And I think it's just like coming back to who are we as humans? And that's what this campaign is about. Let's be relational to each other. And so in China not being our enemy, what is like, why not have the curiosity to what is China instead of what are you being fed as China? And tomorrow we're going to get more of that. So with KJ and Mika, so I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. There's many more layers of this story before we finish the week off. So thank you for joining us. Peace.
Thank you, Jodie. Thank you, Wei. Thank you all. That brings our session to a close for today. As a reminder, it's just the first day of a 5-day program here on Humanity Rising in partnership with CODEPINK. You're all welcome to the after session chat, and we'll see everyone tomorrow for day 2, same time, same station. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.